Chapter 13. In November of 1863, Sandusky was a city accustomed to gray. Most of its inhabitants had at one time or another lined up outside the train depot to watch Confederate officers herded in the direction of the docks for transport to Johnson's Island, 3 miles out in Lake Erie. Businessmen, wives, servants, street vendors, every kind of man, woman, and child would hurl rotten food at the bedraggled rebels, some of whom were so sick they would be placed in the hospital immediately upon entering the prison. When Teague hopped off his train with his valise banging against his crutch, it was too cold and drizzly for many spectators to view the arrival of the newest batch of prisoners. In fact, threadbare rebels had almost become so commonplace in the year or so since the prison was opened that only truant schoolboys and clerks bothered to show the city's disdain for traitors in this kind of weather. Today their coat collars were up and their caps were pulled down while they eyed the prisoners forming ranks, preparing for yet another march to confinement. Invariably, the food the boys held found their way to the scrawniest and most forlorn of the Southerners. One man, whose body was so thin his rags hung off him in folds, caught a half-spoiled apple that was aimed at his head. He bit out the rotten section, the juices running from his mouth down his overgrown beard, and then ate the rest of the fruit. One of the better-dressed clerks grimaced and turned to his companion. "Filthy pigs, they'll eat anything." The prisoner turned to the clerk and grinned with white flecks of apple showing between his teeth. Teague looked away from the prisoners to choose one of the hansoms lined up for disembarked passengers. One had not been engaged yet, probably because its driver seemed harder and more grizzled than the rest. Teague approached the man, assuming from experience that his haggard appearance derived from his honesty. This man made little profit because of his propensity to give a fair deal. "What's the cheapest hotel in town?" Teague asked from below the box, while trying to fasten the top button of his coat with one hand. The driver thought for a minute and answered with a question. "Do you want cheap respectable or cheap cheap?" "Doubly cheap, if you please." "That'd be King's Place. 35 cents a night, 50 with the dinner. It's not much of a dinner, but it's something. Mostly trouble out there, though." "Fine. How much do you charge?" The driver seemed to be calculating mileage, but Teague also saw him glance at the shabby overcoat and linger on the pins that held his pant leg up. 10 cents to King's, he finally decided. The boarding-house was exactly what Teague had pictured except for the color of the paint. A front yard littered with whiskey bottles, torn newspaper, and a broken wagon wheel, a fatted hog wallowing in its sty beside the house, and a cauldron set up nearby. They would be butchering tomorrow if he wasn't mistaken. A group of men had built a fire in the alley between the pigsty and an equally run-down property, and they held their hands above it while watching a mulatto woman pace to and fro on the wrap-around porch. She wore nothing but a Union private's overcoat, missing several of the bottom buttons, and a pair of boots, and every so often she would sit astride an old chair, fan herself as if she could be hot with a November wind blowing in from the lake, reach up for the top button, fumble with it for a few seconds, and then stand again to pace until one or another of the men came to the porch to beg a line of credit. Teague watched one revolution in her cycle before he stepped out of the hansom and spoke to the driver. "Does that go on all night?" "Just until an officer comes along. She's officer material. She's more or less advertisement, though. There's a couple of cheaper ones inside. Most go for them." Teague nodded and took his valise from the box. "Is there a post office near here?" "About 4 blocks down. I can take you." Teague felt the diminishing number of coins in his pocket and shook his head. "Who's the commandant at the prison?" he asked as he handed over the fare. The driver gave no reaction to the odd question except to slip the coin into his pocket. "Colonel Pearson." He took up the reins and glanced down at Teague. "If you're wanting to visit somebody, you can just have me take you back to the station now. He won't let you out there." "Well, I was a military man myself. He may make an exception." Teague let the man drive away with a in return for his brief burst of optimism. He felt the mulatto watching him as he hobbled through the yard debris and up the porch steps. Her gaze seemed almost as intense as that of the men in the alley. When he came to the front door, she leaned against the frame and reached for her top button. But Teague stopped her pitch before it started. "You're too expensive." "Well," she drawled, a gap in her front teeth making the L sound click. "You can wait till tomorrow. The house'll be full up for butchering day's dinner, so I cut my fee. Can't nobody pass up them fresh tenderloins." After having sat for 20 minutes, while the proprietress read over his identification papers and then passed them off to her husband for his perusal, after being led to a room hardly worth the money he paid, and after being informed that he'd have to pay an extra quarter if he wanted any coal for the dilapidated stove in its corner, Teague figured a walk to the post office was in order. As he expected, the clerk there watched his every move while he wrote the short letter requesting Colonel Pearson's leniency and letting him visit the prison, and he only reluctantly accepted the payment for the postage. The man started a bit at the sound of Teague's stomach growling, like an animal instead of a Southerner stood before him, and Teague couldn't help but grin his satisfaction. The feeling couldn't last long, however, as the growling was replaced by an empty nausea. The number of coins in his pocket seemed to be shrinking exponentially, but as he would be late for the hotel's dinner, he stopped at a general store to buy at least a block of cheese and some crackers to eat on the way back. While he was waiting to be served, he watched the cashier dole out some opium pills from a container behind the counter for the customer in front of him. Teague stared at them. He was an idiot for not thinking of this sooner. "I'll have some of those," he said, and pointed to the container. The cheese and crackers were forgotten in his elation that he could keep the pills in his case for now, and transfer them to a safe place in his room at Oakshade without any interference from Dr. Warner. He counted them in his mind during the block and a half left before he arrived at the hotel, and hoped the knowledge of them in his coat pocket would sustain him through the dreariness of the place. The sun had set by the time he reached the house, and he could tell dinner was over from the piano playing and laughter from the parlor. Several black soldiers stood talking on the porch, but the mulatto woman had gone inside. Some of the men had wandered to the alley to share the vagabond's fire. Teague considered joining them in the warmth, but there was something in the raucous conversation that sounded of drunkenness. While he was standing in the yard deliberating whether to impose on the business in the parlor or to brave catching a chill in his room, 4 of the soldiers from the alley crossed the yard and blocked his passage into the house. The shortest of them spoke first. "Where are you from?" "I beg your pardon?" Teague said. "Listen at that," the short one told his friends. "Sit over at the fire you sounded just like an old overseer they had, and here you stand talking like you the master of the world." "I am from Alabama, but I have papers here. I can show you I'm a Union man. They're in my waistcoat pocket. I'm reaching to get them." "Why are you talking so slow?" a second man asked. "'Cause you drunk and stupid, boy," another one answered. "Ain't no getting drunk on my land, boy," the short one tried to mimic Teague's voice. "I take a belt to your back, you'd think twice about getting drunk around here." He returned to his own voice. "Well, you ain't master here, Reb." Teague forced calm into his voice as he drew out his papers. "I was a captain in the Union Army. These will show you." Instead of taking the documents Teague proffered, the shortest man yanked one of his crutches away, while a companion swept his foot against the back of Teague's knee, sending him sprawling into the dirt. Before he could regain his breath, the same foot smashed against his ear so hard that even if Teague could have escaped from the men, he would have vomited from dizziness if he tried to stand. He closed his eyes against the swirling night sky and covered his head with his arms. But there were so many other places on his body for the men to kick. He tried to roll out of the way, but he met feet in all directions. Finally, when he feared he would suffocate from the blows to his sides, the kicking subsided with the repetition of "Leave him be!" from a man outside the circle. Teague lay panting on his side, aware only of the dirt particles flying into his mouth and nose, and the blood dripping from his ear to his neck and onto the ground. "Here, Reb off the island!" the short man yelled back. "I know it!" "Leave him "Be," said the new voice, awful in its authority, "or I'll see to it the captain puts every last one of you to the whipping post." Teague opened his eyes enough to see several other pairs of legs beyond those that had been trying to kill him. Perhaps they belonged to the men on the porch. "Get back to camp before you're missed, and sober up before the captain sees you," the voice ordered. The circle broke up as the chastised few shifted away. Then the new men gathered around Teague. "Give him his things and take him into the house." They set Teague on the stairs out of the glare from the parlor, for which he was grateful. He doubled over to keep the room from spinning, and his stomach from spasming. "I don't mean any offense," the leader said, "but you certainly don't sound like anyone around here. I would like to see those papers of yours." Teague nodded his head between his knee and stump and handed his papers up to the man. He sat up to watch them being read, then leaned forward to assure himself of the face he saw. It was the coal black of unadulterated African descent, the kind of black that people assumed would fit the man for little more than the most brutish of field work. In all his experiences, there was only one person Teague had known who could penetrate that assumption through the sheer undeniability of his intelligence and worth. One slave who could mingle with the lighter house servants on equal terms. One man who could marry a woman so fair that anywhere but on a plantation she would have passed for white. Teague's voice cracked when he spoke. "Henry,"